Introducing Emeritus Professor Richard Bawden from University of Western Sydney and University of Michigan. We've asked Richard to talk about learning and change, and we just want to start with the first question. From your perspective, Richard, what is learning?
Learning for me is the capacity to make sense out of the world about us in order that we might do something. So learning for me combines finding out, taking action.
Okay. What the other part of the subject that we're dealing with is change,
Right.
a term that's been used as transformation.
Yeah.
And what do you understand as transformation?
Well, I found a marvellous model of learning back in the early 1980s by Karen Kitchener. And she argued that there were really three ways, three levels, if you like, of learning. There was learning about the matter to hand, there was learning about how we learn about the matter to hand, and there was learning about the limits to learning. And she labelled these cognition, metacognition, and epistemic cognition. So for me, transformation is at any or all of those levels, which means that we change what we do as a result of the way we answer the questions at those three levels. So what is the situation around me? Meaning to me would be the matter to hand and then how I deal with it. At the meta level, it's how am I dealing with the way I am dealing with the issue, which you might call methods. And you could contrast, for instance, a scientific way of looking at something with a religious way of looking at things, which are two meta questions. And then at the epistemic level, transformation at that level means that I expose my worldview, my set of beliefs and values, to self-critique. And then if I find them inadequate, then the transformation occurs at that level. And in my opinion, higher education should be epistemic cognition. In other words, we should be really trying to deal with how we make sense of the way we make sense. And that sounds philosophical, in some ways it is, but it's a profound question. So higher education really is about the way what we know is limited by how we go about knowing and valuing.
And how about the relationship between what we know and the way we live?
Well, finally, of course, related to what I said at the beginning, that if learning is the process by which we make sense of the world around us in order to adapt to it or adapt the world, then the way we live is determined essentially precisely by that. So the whole point about living is a constant process of learning, and at the base of all of that is the notion of improvement or development. So there is this constant idea that because the world is constantly changing, we too have to constantly change. And so the way we live, our lifestyle, our well-being, is in the end related to the way we make sense of the world about us.
Okay, so how do we arrive at this sort of learning?
With considerable difficulty. It's to do with, first of all, consciousness of knowing the model, and that's why this work of Karen Kitchener's was so attractive to me in the early 1980s, was that it provided a very simple but very persuasive model. So it's consciousness, first of all, that the way of looking at learning this way is useful, not necessarily correct, but really useful. And once you've done that, then it's a matter of experiencing as many different experiences as you can, particularly putting yourself into situations you've never been in before, and then seeking unfamiliar ways of dealing with this new unfamiliarity, with dealing with uncertainty, for instance, without relying on certainty. So we don't try and reduce uncertainty to certainty, we actually deal with uncertainty.
What advice might you give to young students, sort of 21, 22 years old, when they're sort of dealing with these sorts of questions?
Yeah, that's a really good question. My own curricular background is in experiential learning. In other words, for me, the most rich learning in terms of all I've talked about so far is to actually get into a world and experience it. So sitting in a classroom or even watching tapes like this is an informing for making sense of the world you're in. But unless you're in a changing world, you actually will never appreciate why you need to change to know differently. And so my advice to all students is to get yourself into as many different experiences, to experience as many different situations and conditions as you can, and then try and make sense out of them, recognising that your traditional way of trying to make sense doesn't necessarily fit what it is you're now experiencing. Therefore, that demands you address it.